Hi, Team Awesome. Sadie here, talking about Notice and Note Part 1. Have the book. And as I promised, I'm doing a video this week to get us started. And I just want to talk about some highlights in Part 1 that I saw. So Part 1 went through a series of 10 questions. Question 1 is reading still reading? And I want to share in each section some quotes that stood out to me and some questions I have for you, and you can answer them either via video or type up the answers, or just to get the conversation started, what came to mind while you were reading. So question 1 is reading still reading? The big question for me in your classrooms is what type of reading are you doing with your students? Are they using online readers, Nooks? Are they still reading hardbound books? What types of texts are you having students read? The quote that stood out to me in this part is that now more than ever, this is page 13, now more than ever, reading seems to be a social act, and that Americans are spending more time socially interacting online and doing this through reading, and how are we fostering this in our classrooms? Question 2 was, what is the role of fiction? As we all know, Common Core State Standards has pushed for nonfiction in the classrooms. And as teachers of language arts, what does that mean for us? And this chapter really stood out to me in several ways, some quotes that stood out. Nonfiction lets us learn more. Fiction lets us be more. That was on page 17. And then more on the side of character growth and character development, the quote on page 18, that reading stories can actually improve your social skills by helping you better understand other human beings. The process of entering imagined worlds of fiction builds empathy and improves your ability to take another person's point of view. It can even change your personality. And that really stood out to me, of the importance of not only reading, but sharing reading and looking at individual perspective when we read and letting students share that. I know that novels have certainly shaped my life and my view of the world and my view of others. Question 3 was, where does rigor fit? So Common Core State Standards has pushed for more rigor in the classroom, and that there's a big divide between rigor and hard. So what makes something hard or what makes something rigorous? And I liked the quote on page 20, rigor resides in the energy and attention given to the text, not in the text itself, but how much time and effort we put into really analyzing a piece of text. And then on page 21, rigor is not an attribute of a text, but rather a characteristic of our behavior with that text. Put another way, rigor resides in the energy and attention given to the text, not in the text itself. I guess I starred the same quote, must be a really strong one, so I liked that one a lot. Then, question 4, what does it mean by intellectual communities? And this chapter really, or this section really went into kind of building that community in the classroom and the importance of communication. Question 5, what is the role of talk? And this really stood out to me. It's one aim that I have with my class, is that I'm really pushing more academic conversations, and that students talk about what they're doing and their knowledge and what they're learning, instead of just taking it in and letting it be an independent act. So the quote that stood out to me was on page 27. We think that when kids are engaged, when they are active co-constructors of their knowledge, then they are more likely to take ownership, to discover relevance, and to ask why and why not. They are more likely to feel inspired when they realize their voice matters and their questions count more than their answers. So really trying to emphasize having students ask questions and be inquisitive in regards to their learning. This chapter then goes on to a lot of tips for improving student-to-student discourse. I thought there were some cool activities in there and some stuff that I think I've done, and I'm sure many of you have done before, so it's not necessarily new. But I did like on page 33 the rigor and talk and how to kind of boost those questions that help facilitate discussion and have students think critically about what they're studying. What is the role of close reading? I've seen close reading, different teachers explain it in many different ways, and so this is a nice clarification, and I think a lot of people do it differently. But the quote that stood out to me was on page 37, is what we want is to notice those elements of the text that are, for example, surprising or confusing or contradictory, so that when we pause and take note, think carefully, reread, analyze, read closely. So the idea of you take a short passage, you focus intensely on it, you read it, reread it, explore it, discuss it, and build understanding from that. Question number 7, do text-dependent questions foster engagement? Yes. Okay, so that was my answer to that. So it went into text-dependent questions, and the Common Core virtually, 39, virtually eliminated text to self-connections. I don't think I realized that, and that's sad to me because I think my connection with novels comes from my personal connections first, and then my connections to other texts in the life, in the world around me. So that was that chapter. The page 42 is the quote that stood out to me, and it was from Making Meaning with Texts, and the quote is, "Meaning, whether scientific or aesthetic, whether a poem or a scientific report, happens during the interplay between particular signs and a particular reader at a particular time and place." And that just made me think about how many of my students have often said they've already read a book before, and how many times I've reread texts throughout my life and have had different interpretations based on what I'm going through or my experiences that I've lived that I might not have lived when I read it the first time. Specifically, thinking of books that I read in high school, such as To Kill a Mockingbird, and the impact it had on me as a 9th grade student, to rereading it in my undergrad and teaching it and what that meant. So kind of having that different perspective. And then the idea of having students create text-dependent questions. I really liked that section that we have to show students how to create those questions and help them create them. Then question number 8, must everyone read the same book? So my big question for you is, do you have everyone read the same book in your class? If so, how often throughout the school year? Do you do readers' workshops? Or do you do kind of group reading groups where you have several novels going at the same time around a particular theme, topic, time in history, and what does that reading look like in your classroom? For my class, I focused mostly on small group reading to whole class reading. This year so far we've done only whole class reading, and I would like to try out some readers workshop as the year goes on. So what are you doing? How is it working? What do you recommend? I do think that reading a book as a whole class builds that understanding and creates that community that tied back to the first question, and that people want to be a part of that community. And then question number 9, how do I judge the complexity of a text? So my questions for you is, how do you judge texts? How does this change your teaching of the text? For me, many of my students read, at my school, my students start off at a 5th grade level, and they're in high school, so 9th to 12th graders that are reading at a 5th grade level. I have students in my classroom that read as low as a 2nd grade level and as high as about a 9th to 10th grade level. And in some of the other classrooms, we definitely have students that read at a college level, and I think this becomes challenging. I know that text is complex, but supporting my students in reading that is what I aim to do. And so the way that I judge the complexity of a text is the many ways it talks about here is looking at what are the connections my students have with it, what is the extra schema and background knowledge that I have to present in a class so that they can start building connections, and then doing a lot of close reading to whole class reading, oral reading, and then some independent reading at home to let them play around with the text on their own. Sometimes I think students need that independent time, even if the text is complex, to really understand what's going on that they can't get if they're just listening to it and they can't pause at their own speed and reread at their own tempo. So, I'm always surprised by the Lexile levels and the stretch in Lexile levels. What are your thoughts on that? It brings up that Monster is at a Lexile level of 670, so that puts that at a second to third grade level with the new Lexile levels. And it even had it second to third before, and I don't know if I definitely agree. I don't agree with Lexile levels, but I think the stretch is pretty far and what they expect a student to be able to read, and I don't know if that's necessarily closing the achievement gap or building a bigger gap, because these Lexiles certainly built a much bigger gap in the way they're created. And then lastly, question number 10, are we creating lifelong learners? And that's our aim, that's my goal, is to have lifelong learners. So I liked the quote on page 62, school ought to be a place where you go to develop a passion for learning, for a lifetime of learning. And this notion that students should recognize in high school that they're there, solely there to learn, and what an amazing experience that is. And I don't know if all of our students truly realize that opportunity they have. And it's my goal that we can make that happen. So do you feel that your students are lifelong learners, and how do you help establish that and create that foundation so that they continue to learn well beyond high school? And that was the end of Notice and Note Part 1, and I hope this video was entertaining, and hopefully we can start a good discussion that kind of builds our understanding of what we're doing in the classroom around reading. I hope you all had a good week. I missed you in class. Obviously we didn't have class, but I believe I'll see you next week, and we'll continue to discuss. Take care. Bye.